They always tell you that Toronto is polite, that in this city the worst thing you'll hear is a sorry. But the room went sharp the moment he said it, and sorry vanished like steam from a winter grate. Is this a joke? The words cracked across the dining room of the Lakeview Conservatory, a glass-walled jewel box perched above downtown. Forks paused mid-air. Candles flickered as if a draft had cut through the room. At a corner table overlooking the lattice of King Street, Charlotte Fraser sat in a sleek black wheelchair, posture perfect, eyes steady, fingers laced atop a linen napkin. Her dress, a midnight blue sheath, caught the light and scattered it like small, private stars. She looked powerful. She looked prepared. She did not look ready to bleed. The man standing by her table, tall, pale, crisp shirt immaculate, tilted his head in the curious way of someone inspecting a painting they'd only seen online. You didn't say, he gestured, careless and theatrical, toward the chair. There was movement behind him, the silver flash of a server's tray turning, a couple whispering behind their wine glasses. Charlotte felt it like static, the room's attention spooling around her. She had rehearsed for this. She had known it was a risk. She told herself she was a CEO, the youngest in Canada to take a biotech to an IPO, a woman who had argued down hedge funds and outmaneuvered pharmaceutical royalties. But that was boardrooms and balance sheets. This was a man in a white shirt pretending to be confused by wheels. My profile said I'm direct, Charlotte said, voice smooth, controlled. I assumed we were meeting for a conversation, not a performance review. A smile thin, brittle creased his face. Right, a conversation with Charlotte Fraser, the wonder kind of synthetic therapeutics. Cover of Global Business. Not, he flicked his fingers again, the gesture smaller now, nastier. Whatever this is. Across the room, a phone rose and hovered. The screen's reflection glowed blue against a wine glass. Someone mouthed, "Is that her?" Charlotte's hand tightened beneath the table. The tendons in her wrist pressed like small cables under skin. She kept her face neutral. Her spine remained a ruler. She had learned, after the accident, that stillness could be its own kind of refusal. "I'm going to go," she said, reaching for her clutch, already calculating the best path to the elevator. The angle of the carpet seam near the host stand. The drop at the doorway where the tile met the wood. "Enjoy your evening." "Sure," he said, louder now, for the room. "Run over someone else's expectations." A soft sound broke from the nearest table, a half gasp, half laugh strangled at birth. The manager was moving, but too slowly, as if etiquette were a chain around his ankle. The phone hovered higher. Toronto held its breath, and then the doors parted with a whisper of hydraulics. He didn't belong in this room. You could see it in the denim jacket, in the boots scuffed pale at the toes, in the hands that looked like they had stories to tell about wrenches and winter. He paused just inside, scanning with a mechanic's precision, then walked the long line of tables without hesitation. Not toward the man in the shirt, toward her. "Miss Fraser," he said, voice low enough to calm a spooked horse. He didn't look at the stairs, the camera, the manager's stiff smile. He looked at Charlotte like she was a person in need of an exit, not a symbol in need of saving. "Are you ready to go?" Her first impulse was suspicion. Was this a stunt? Some misguided chivalry for the feed? But his gaze was steady, unperformative. There was no pity, no bright brittle heroism. Just focus, just presence, just a hand hovering a respectful inch behind her shoulder, waiting for permission. She nodded once. "Hey," the man in the shirt called, voice pitching upward as his audience slipped away. "We're not done." The newcomer finally looked at him, and in that look there was nothing sharp, nothing loud, only the kind of firm you learn on January mornings when engines won't turn, and the metal bites your breath. "She is," he said. They left without drama, which somehow felt like the most dramatic thing of all. The manager didn't block them. The phone lowered. The city's lights pressed in against the glass. Streetcars hummed distant and red. At the elevator, Charlotte inhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been rationing air until now. In the lobby's marble hush, he stepped aside and let her lead. Automatic doors sighed open and winter air pressed its cold mouth gently to her cheeks. Toronto at street level smelled like snow and exhaust and the faint, salty memory of the lake. "I'm sorry," he said, the apology quiet, honest, uncomplicated. I saw what was happening and couldn't just watch. Charlotte angled her chair so she could see him fully. He was taller than she'd thought, the jacket darker, the collar frayed at one edge. A grease-stained rag peeked from his pocket like a flag from a different country. His hair was the kind that refused to behave, his jaw shadowed. There was a nick on one knuckle, half-healed. "You don't know me," she said. He shrugged a little. Didn't need to. Snow was beginning to sift down, the kind that looks harmless but insists. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel McCarthy, Charlotte," she replied, then added, because it felt like naming a houseplant by its Latin genus. "Fraser." "Yeah," he said, not impressed. Not intimidated, just acknowledging a fact. "The way you acknowledge the temperature. You eat." The question caught her off guard. "Not yet. There's a spot a few blocks over," he said. "Not fancy. Plastic forks. Best hot butter lobster roll in this city when it's cold." "Well," he amended, a small grin trying itself out on his mouth. "Top 3. The right answer was no. The right answer was a private car, a penthouse, a hot shower, an inbox stacked with problems that obeyed calendars and cash flows. But the room upstairs still vibrated in her bones. The phone hover still hummed under her skin. And there was something in the way he stood with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets and hurried, unafraid of silence that felt like a door she hadn't tried in a long time. "Lead on," she said. They moved in companionable quiet along King, past windows spilling golden rectangles onto salt-scarred sidewalks. The snow thickened, stippling the air. Daniel kept pace perfectly, not hovering, not lagging, letting her set the rhythm. He angled his body into the wind as if he could break it up before it reached her. At a corner near Spadina, the glow of a food truck cut through the dusk, a little aluminum island, its menu scrawled in chalk that someone had gone over with a mittened hand. Steam ghosted from the serving hatch. A cluster of people huddled under the awning, shoulders touching, breath clouding. The kind of true strangers make around warmth. Daniel ordered without asking one roll for each of them. Extra lemon, a paper cup of chowder that promised to leave a map of cream on your lips. "Trust me," he said when she raised an eyebrow. "It's the sort of food that forgives days like this." The server slid their food across the counter in red-striped boats. A tangle of butter-glossed lobster glowed against the bun like rescued coral. Charlotte reached. The chair shifted a centimeter, the boat tipped, and a ribbon of melted butter leapt the lip and painted a bright trail. Across the leather of her right shoe the old panic surged a snap of heat, a rush of shame, the reflex to apologize for physics. She braced for the flurry of sorries, the clumsy reach of hands that didn't know where to land, the theatrical fussing that made messes feel like metaphors. Daniel didn't make a sound. He pulled the rag from his pocket, a square of soft, clean flannel despite the stain at one edge, and crouched. Not performative, not swooping, not saintly, just practical. He steadied the front wheel with the heel of his palm, dabbed the butter away in small, efficient strokes, then lifted her foot with both hands and rested it gently back on the footplate. The whole motion was unremarkable and therefore remarkable. "There," he said, standing. Back to factory settings. It was absurd ridiculous to feel a tremor in her throat over butter and flannel, and a stranger's steady hands. But it came anyway. That tightness you get when the world pretends to stop treating you like glass and actually does. She blinked hard, found her voice, aimed it carefully. "Thank you, it's just butter," he said. "It isn't," she replied, and left it at that. They ate under the awning, snow muttering at the edge of the light. The first bite was heat in ocean, and something unpretentious that flooded the spaces. Where adrenaline had been camped, lemon cut through the butter like someone opening a window. The chowder's steam fogged her glasses, and she laughed, surprised at the sound, the ease of it. Daniel grinned around a mouthful, wiped his thumb along his wrist like he'd just tightened a bolt. "You know," he said after a moment, "Toronto's nice because the city minds its own business. But sometimes it minds it too much. Tonight it minded a lot," Charlotte said. "It watched," he said. Not the same thing. They finished in a silence that wasn't empty. Trucks hummed. Somewhere, a siren stitched the blocks together. Charlotte felt the night tilt by a degree, the way a compass needle twitches toward north without fanfare. When they parted at the corner, he didn't ask for her number. He didn't announce a plan. He only glanced at the snow, at her, at the city that had been kind and unkind in the same hour. "Get home safe, Miss Fraser," he said, and somehow made the honorific sound like respect, not distance. "Good night, Mr. McCarthy," she said, and rolled away. The taste of lemon and something like possibility bright on her tongue. Toronto didn't sleep. Not really. Even on a weeknight, the city's arteries hummed with late-night taxis, the clatter of the streetcars dragging themselves along Queen Street, and the muffled bass of rooftop bars that refused to yield to the cold. Charlotte Fraser had returned to her penthouse on Bay, floor-to-ceiling glass that made her feel both untouchable and exposed, and found herself staring down at the miniature grid of headlights below. She told herself she should be working. She had a dozen investor calls waiting in the morning, and a report on new gene editing protocols was still unread in her inbox. But instead, her thoughts kept looping back to the stranger with the ragged jacket, the mechanic who appeared in her life like a misplaced brushstroke on a perfect canvas. Daniel McCarthy. She remembered the way he had crouched, the casual respect in his hands, the absence of pity. It had unsettled her more than the cruelty in the restaurant ever could. Cruelty, she knew how to fight. Dismissal, she knew how to endure. But kindness, the kind that didn't come wrapped in obligation or pity, felt foreign, like a language she hadn't spoken in years. The next morning, Toronto's sky was a flat pewter. Snow had fallen overnight, smothering the sidewalks in a powder that city plows turned to gray slush by noon. Charlotte wheeled herself into the glass lobby of her company's headquarters, greeted by the clipped heels of assistants and the hushed tones of analysts. Everyone said good morning, Miss Fraser, with a smile that strained to hard. She gave nods in return, her armor firmly back in place, but in the reflection of the elevator doors, she caught her own expression, distant, restless, and, for the first time in a long while, curious. That evening, when the board dinner ended earlier than expected, she surprised herself. Instead of calling her driver, she directed her chair toward the subway entrance at Union Station. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and diesel. She moved through the crowd with a practiced rhythm, ignoring the looks, the sidesteps, the not-so-subtle pity, and then she heard it. A laugh, low, warm, unpolished, carried from across the concourse. Daniel was there, bent under the hood of a weathered Chevy truck parked near the curb, grease painting a dark crescent on his forearm. His jacket looked the same, too thin for the weather, shoulders dusted with snowflakes. A younger kid stood beside him, maybe 17, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. "Give it a go now," Daniel called, and the truck coughed, then roared alive. The boy whooped, pumping a fist. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder, grinning like he'd just won the Stanley Cup. Charlotte hesitated in the shadow of the station doors. She could leave. She should leave. But something in her resisted. Still saving damsels in distress? She asked finally, her voice carrying across the cold air. Daniel turned, surprised, then smiled, an easy curve of lips that didn't try to impress. Only when they drive trucks held together with duct tape. The boy muttered a thank you and drove off, leaving the two of them under the sodium glow of the street lamp. Daniel wiped his hands on the rag, then tucked it back into his pocket. "How's the lobster roll holding up?" he asked. She blinked. "You remembered. I don't forget good food," he said simply. They walked well. He walked, and she rolled through the bustle of Front Street. The air smelled of salt and snow, the lake's breath creeping into the city. Charlotte found herself talking, almost without realizing, about her accident on a ski trip in Whistler, about the weeks in rehab when even brushing her hair had felt like climbing Everest, about how investors looked at her now with a kind of restrained discomfort, as though her body were a liability line on a spreadsheet. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't say you're brave or you're strong. He just listened, eyes steady, pace matched to hers, silence thick but never suffocating. When she finally stopped, embarrassed by how much she'd revealed, he shrugged lightly. "People see what they want to see. Doesn't mean you have to carry it." Simple, direct, and somehow heavier than all the empty encouragements she had swallowed in the last 3 years. They ended up in a quiet corner cafe near Kensington Market, the kind with chalkboard menus and chipped mugs. Daniel ordered black coffee. Charlotte ordered tea she didn't really want. The windows fogged as snow pressed against the glass. "You don't belong in places like that," she said suddenly, thinking of the Lakeview Conservatory. The glass and steel, and cruelty wrapped in polite tones. Daniel sipped his coffee, unfazed. "Maybe not, but I figure people don't belong in cages either, even if the bars are gold." Charlotte's throat tightened. She thought of her penthouse, her boardroom, her reputation polished like marble. A cage. She had never let herself use the word, but now it hung in the air, undeniable. As they stepped back into the snow, Charlotte realized something had shifted. The world still judged her, still whispered, still stared. But with Daniel beside her, the weight of it felt a little less crushing, as if some invisible load had been halved for the first time in years. She caught herself smiling at nothing, at no one. Just the sheer strangeness of being seen. And in that fragile warmth, under Toronto's falling snow, the seeds of something began to take root. Something dangerous. Something inevitable. The snow was lighter in Montreal, like sifted sugar on the cobblestones of the old port. The city breathed differently here, narrow streets hemmed in by stone buildings. The glow of cafes spilling warmth onto sidewalks where horse-drawn carriages waited for tourists. Charlotte Fraser rolled down Rue St. Paul with Daniel McCarthy walking steady at her side. And for the first time since Whistler, she wasn't thinking about escape routes or tilted thresholds. She was just there. They hadn't planned this trip. Charlotte had meetings in the city with Quebec investors, and when she mentioned it over coffee, Daniel had surprised her with a simple, "I'll be in town that weekend. Want to grab a bite?" She had almost said no, almost reverted to the reflexive wall that had kept her safe for years. But then she remembered the lobster roll, the rag in his pocket, the way he never flinched from her silence. And she had said yes. Now here they were, a biotech CEO in a tailored coat worth more than his entire month's rent, and a mechanic whose boots left dark prints across the fresh dusting of snow. An odd pair, if you asked anyone. But no one was asking. And that was the relief of Montreal. The city didn't care who you were, as long as you could keep pace with its heartbeat. "Hungry?" Daniel asked as they passed a row of food stalls strung with yellow bulbs. The air smelled of garlic, soy, and roasted meat. "I had lunch with investors," Charlotte admitted. "But no, not really." He smirked. Translation: you pushed lettuce around a plate and pretended it filled you. Her laugh surprised her, spilling out before she could stop it. "You're not wrong." He guided her toward a food cart manned by a broad-shouldered vendor in a wool cap. The sign was handwritten in both English and French: brochettes, dumplings, sparkling water. Nothing fancy, nothing curated for Instagram. Just food. Daniel ordered without hesitation, 2 skewers, fried dumplings, sparkling water. Charlotte didn't protest. Part of her wanted to test this, to see if she could step outside the lacquered bubble of her life. When the food came, the server leaned too far across her chair, balancing the tray at an awkward angle. A thick streak of sauce slipped free, splattering across her leather shoe and ankle. The world stopped. Charlotte froze, muscles tightening as if bracing for impact. She knew what came next: the flustered apologies, the pity-laden stares, the scramble of napkins that always seemed louder than the accident itself. She hated these moments more than boardroom betrayals, more than quarterly losses. This was when people remembered she was different. Her face burned. She wanted to disappear into the cobblestones. But Daniel didn't fumble. He didn't gasp. He didn't throw out a pity-soaked sorry. Instead, he reached calmly into his denim jacket and pulled out the rag. The same rag, folded neatly, the edges darkened by grease and time. "Hold on," he murmured, crouching beside her. Before she could protest, he steadied the wheel with his palm and dabbed the sauce from the leather in small, unhurried motions. His touch was practical, steady. He wasn't rescuing her. He wasn't elevating himself. He was just fixing a problem. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he lifted her foot gently, supporting it with both hands, and placed it back on the footrest. His movements were respectful, confident, quiet. Not a flicker of pity, not a shred of hesitation. "There," he said, straightening. Good as new. Charlotte's throat constricted. No one had touched her like that since before the accident. Every gesture she'd endured since had been dripping with either awkwardness or condescension. But Daniel's hands calloused sure carried none of that. They carried dignity. They carried care. She blinked hard, fighting back tears. The sauce was gone, but the ache in her chest remained. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel shrugged, a grin tugging at one corner of his mouth. "It's just sauce." "No," she said, more firmly this time. "It isn't." Their eyes locked. For a suspended moment, the old port disappeared, the laughter of families, the clinking bottles, the music of street performers. It was just the two of them in a bubble of quiet recognition. The spell broke with the hiss of a grill. Daniel gestured toward the skewers. "Eat before it gets cold. Food like this doesn't wait." Charlotte laughed softly, a sound that startled even her. She bit into the skewer, garlic and ginger bursting across her tongue, char clinging to the meat. The taste was simple, unpretentious, real. It wasn't just food. It was freedom. They ate under the string lights, knees almost brushing across the small table. Daniel devoured his skewer into bites, then tore into the dumplings with the hunger of someone who never turned down a hot meal. Charlotte ate slower, savoring every detail, the crunch of the wrapper, the warmth of the filling, the sparkle of water cutting through grease. "You're staring," Daniel said without looking up. "I'm observing," Charlotte replied. "Same thing." He smirked, eyes flicking toward hers. "Not when you're me," she countered. For a moment, his smirk softened. "Fair." When the plates were empty, Daniel leaned back, hands behind his head, boots planted firm on the cobblestones. "See, told you it was worth it." Charlotte didn't answer. She was too busy memorizing this moment of being ordinary, unarmored, free. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't Charlotte Fraser, CEO. She wasn't Charlotte Fraser, the paralyzed woman in the chair. She was just Charlotte. And Daniel McCarthy, the mechanic from Hamilton, had made that possible with nothing more than a rag, a steady hand, and a refusal to look away. The river was a sheet of black glass under the February sky, the St. Lawrence humming low and endless beyond the old port. Charlotte Fraser rolled along the promenade, her chair's wheels whispering against the ancient bricks, while Daniel McCarthy kept pace with the easy stride of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. Snow fell in stray flurries, dusting his shoulders, catching in her hair like tiny cold sparks. She had almost begged off after dinner. Old habits told her to retreat, to escape into the controlled sterility of hotel suites, where no accidents could happen, where she could wall herself in with reports and emails and pretend food stalls and grease rags didn't exist. But when Daniel had said, "Come walk by the river," something in his tone and hurried, free of expectation, had made no feel like a prison sentence. Yes slipped out before she even realized. The old port at night was a contradiction, history and neon colliding, horse hooves clattering against cobbles, the smell of roasted nuts mixing with the faint tang of diesel from the river. Couples strolled arm in arm, bundled against the cold. A child squealed as his mittened hand reached too close to the ice sculpture of a polar bear. The city lived, unbothered by its own seams. "Do you come here often?" Charlotte asked, instantly regretting how cliché it sounded. Daniel shrugged. "Not really. Hamilton's more my speed. But I like Montreal. It's alive." "You make Hamilton sound like a morgue." He chuckled, low and warm. "It's not dead. Just slower, less. Glass towers, more steel beams. You'd hate it." She arched an eyebrow. "You don't know what I'd hate." He glanced at her, lips twitching. "Fair enough." As they turned a corner, a saxophone's cry slipped into the air, mournful, velvet, irresistible. A street musician stood beneath a lamppost, his case open at his feet, the light turning the brass of his instrument into molten gold. The melody curled through the cold, sweet and aching. Charlotte stopped. Something in her chest tightened, sharp and nostalgic. Her mother had loved jazz. Sunday mornings, the house filled with vinyl crackle and saxophones as she braided Charlotte's hair before church. That was years ago, before Whistler, before the chair, before silence had become her default. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't ask. He just stood beside her, hands in his pockets, letting the music do the talking. For once, Charlotte didn't feel the need to fill the air with words. They simply listened, to figures on the edge of the crowd, sharing a stillness that felt intimate. When the song ended, Daniel dug a crumpled bill from his pocket and dropped it into the case. The musician nodded without breaking rhythm, sliding into the next tune. "Want to sit for a while?" Daniel asked. Charlotte nodded. He guided her to a bench overlooking the river. The saxophone carried, weaving into the splash of water against stone. Her shoulders relaxed without her noticing. It wasn't grand gestures. It wasn't diamonds or chauffeured cars or staged philanthropy dinners. It was this, Daniel's quiet presence, his willingness to meet her in silence without demanding a mask. "You're hard to read," she murmured. "Good," he said simply. Her laugh came out louder than expected, sharp and real. A couple nearby turned to look. She didn't care. Later, as they left the music behind and strolled further along the promenade, Daniel paused by a patch of snow where wildflowers had somehow survived. In a crack between the stones, their stems stubborn and crooked against the cold, he bent, plucked a small handful, purple, uneven, imperfect hand, held them out with an awkward half grin. "They're not roses," he admitted, "but they're alive." Charlotte stared at the bouquet, ridiculous and fragile in his grease-stained hand. She should have found it silly. Instead, her throat ached. She reached out and took them, pressing the stems to her lap like treasure. "No one's given me flowers in a long time," she said softly. "They don't know what they're missing," Daniel replied. Back at her hotel, Charlotte surprised herself again. Instead of collapsing into bed or diving into a spreadsheet, she pulled out an old leather sketchbook from her suitcase. It had been untouched for years. Her mother had given it to her when she was 17, urging her to draw the world the way she saw it. She hadn't drawn since the accident. Her hands moved almost on their own. Graphite whispered across the page, shaping the line of a denim jacket. The curve of a man crouched beneath a lamppost, grease smudges on his hands, head bent in quiet concentration. She drew Daniel the way he had looked tonight, steady, present, unaware he was being seen. When she leaned back, her chest tightened. It wasn't just a sketch. It was proof that some part of her, long buried under board meetings and pitying stares, had woken up again. The next morning, Daniel texted her. "Not flowers, not flattery, not performance. Just didn't get to finish my dumplings. Want to help me fix that tonight?" Charlotte stared at the message, her fingers hovering. Then, with the smallest smile tugging at her lips, she typed back one word, "yes." For weeks after Montreal, Charlotte Fraser lived in a rhythm she hadn't known she craved. No gala dinners, no tense boardroom rehearsals, just text messages that arrived without agenda. Just late-night walks by the lake where Daniel McCarthy pushed nothing except conversation forward. Just paper cups of coffee and quiet jokes about streetcars that always ran late. She had never let herself imagine something so ordinary. Yet it was precisely the ordinariness that felt extraordinary. And then, without warning, it ended. It began with a missed call, then a day without a message, then 3. By the end of the first week, Charlotte stared at her phone until the screen blurred, her thumb hovering over drafts she never sent. "Hey, are you okay? Was it something I said?" She erased each one before it left her outbox. The silence pressed on her chest like a second paralysis. She told herself she was being irrational. Men grew busy. Mechanics didn't live by calendars the way CEOs did. But deep down, she felt it an absence too sharp to be an accident. On the 9th day, the truth arrived in the coldest way possible. A single line of text, to clean, to precise, to final. "I met someone else." "Don't wait." Charlotte read it once, twice again. Her body refused to react. No tears, no scream, no fury. Just numbness, like her nerve endings had been switched off again. As they had that night on Whistler's mountain slope, her father's voice whispered in the void. "No one will carry your dead weight. Men might flirt, but they'll always leave." Richard Fraser had said it years ago, at her hospital bedside. He hadn't meant it as cruelty. He had meant it as realism, the kind fathers wield like blunt instruments. And now, even Daniel, warm, honest Daniel, had proved him right. Charlotte withdrew. She canceled dinners. She cut meetings short. Assistants whispered about her sharpness, investors about her distraction. She locked herself in her penthouse at Bay and College, lights dimmed, curtains drawn against the glittering skyline she no longer wanted to claim. But when the rain came, cold, insistent rain, that blurred the CN Tower into a smear of gray. She couldn't stay still. Her wheels carried her out into the storm, cardigan soaked, hair plastered to her forehead. She let the water sting, let the city smear around her dot, and without quite meaning to, she found herself on a familiar street. A street that smelled faintly of oil and gasoline. A street that led to a garage in Hamilton. Daniel's garage. The bay doors were closed. Rain streaking down the corrugated steel. A flickering lamppost threw weak light across the puddles. Charlotte sat beneath it, the storm soaking her through, the silence louder than the rain. She told herself she wouldn't knock. She told herself she'd just sit, breathe, and then leave. But before she could decide, the world lurched. A pair of headlights cut across the wet asphalt. Tires hissed. A horn blared. Charlotte didn't see the car until it was too late. It hydroplaned across the slick street, veering toward the lamppost where she sat frozen. Her hands jerked at the wheels, but the chair was sluggish in the downpour. The car bore down, and then she wasn't in her chair at all. She was in someone's arms. Strong, shaking arms that clutched her like she was the only solid thing in the flood. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She looked up, rain blurring her vision. Liam. She gasped, then caught herself. Daniel. His face was pale, hair dripping, eyes wide with panic. His chest rose and fell like he had sprinted through fire. I saw you crossing, he panted. God, Charlotte. That car, you left me, she whispered, the words ripping raw from her throat. Her lips quivered. You left me. Daniel's arms tightened, not from cold but from something heavier, guilt, fear, desperation. His forehead dropped against hers, rain sliding down both their faces like stars streaking to earth. I thought, his voice cracked, I thought you needed protecting. From me. From this. What I needed, she choked, was the truth. What I needed was you. The silence was electric, rain hammering the world around them. For a moment, nothing existed but his face, her tears, the weight of everything unsaid. I'm sorry, Daniel whispered. Charlotte lifted her trembling hand, brushed rain or maybe tears from his cheek. And then, before she could think, before fear could interfere, she leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss wasn't polished. It wasn't cinematic. It was messy, wet, desperate. But it was real. There in the middle of the storm-soaked street, Toronto disappeared. The glass towers, the pitying stares, the boardrooms, all of it dissolved until there was only them. When they broke apart, she gasped, rain and breath tangled. I want this, she said fiercely. I want you. Daniel exhaled, shaking, a broken laugh cutting through his panic. You're going to get soaked, she smiled through tears. Too late. The sound of an engine cut through the storm. A sleek black car pulled to the curb. The back door opened. Her father stepped out. Richard Fraser's silver hair, tailored overcoat, eyes cold enough to cut glass, stood in the rain like it didn't touch him. His gaze flicked from Charlotte to Daniel, darkening with contempt. I see you've brought him here, he said flatly. Charlotte didn't flinch. Her voice was steady, unwavering. I have. Because I want you to look him in the eye when you tell me why I don't deserve love. The rain pounded harder. The street went silent. The storm inside Charlotte had only just begun. The rain did not let up. It only thickened into needles that slashed across the street, as though Toronto itself had conspired to stage this confrontation. Water streamed down the shoulders of Richard Fraser's overcoat, but he didn't so much as flinch. His gaze, sharp as ice, cut past Charlotte's soaked hair, past the trembling flowers in her lap, and fixed on Daniel McCarthy with a disdain so pure it was almost theatrical. This man has no place in your life, Richard said, each word hammered flat, precise. Not now. Not ever. Daniel shifted, his hands still steady on the back of Charlotte's chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I didn't ask for a place in her world. She gave me one. Charlotte's pulse thudded in her ears. She had rehearsed speeches for years, imagined one day standing up to her father, not in a boardroom, not with a lawyer's script, but as his daughter. And now here it was, unfolding not in the marble foyer of the Fraser estate, but in the flooded street of a working-class neighborhood, rain plastering her dress to her skin. He's right, she said, lifting her chin. I gave him that place, and I won't take it back. Richard's eyes narrowed. You are the CEO of a multinational. You carry a legacy that spans 3 generations, and you're willing to throw it all away for a man who smells of oil and gasoline? The insult was meant for Daniel, but Charlotte caught the sting anyway. For years she had believed legacy was her spine, the thing that held her upright when her legs could not. But looking at Daniel now, hair dripping into his eyes, jaw set with quiet resolve, she realized the truth. Legacy had been her cage. "If love means losing all that," she said, her voice fierce enough to slice through the storm, "then I'll lose it." Daniel's head snapped toward her. "Charlotte," but she didn't let him finish. Her eyes were locked on Richard, whose face had gone still, unreadable. "You told me once no one would carry me," she said. "You were wrong. I don't need carrying. I need someone who walks beside me." "And he does for the first time," Richard faltered. The rain pooled in his lashes, and for a heartbeat, Charlotte thought she saw the outline of a man, not an empire. But then the steel returned. "You walk out that door with him," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous, "and you do not come back. Not to the company, not to the estate, not to me." The words were a blade. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Charlotte reached for her wheel rims, her hands slick with rain. She turned her chair slowly, deliberately, until her back faced her father. "Then this is goodbye." They left the street together, Daniel's stride steady beside her. The rain blurred everything into silver and shadow. Charlotte's breath came ragged, half from adrenaline, half from the weight of what she had just severed. But she didn't cry. Not yet. At the edge of the block, Daniel stopped. He crouched until their eyes were level, his rough hands finding hers, still cool from the storm. "You shouldn't have to give up your life for me," he said quietly. Charlotte studied his face, the worry, the weariness, the unshakable decency. "I didn't give up my life," she whispered. "I walked away from a prison I mistook for a legacy. You gave me the courage to want more than survival." Daniel's throat bobbed. He didn't answer, but his grip tightened on her hands, anchoring her in the chaos. That night, the storm rolled east, leaving the city slick and breathless. Charlotte and Daniel ended up at his garage, not by plan, but by instinct. The space was small, cluttered with tools and the smell of engine grease, but it was warm, real, alive. They sat side by side on mismatched stools, steam curling from 2 mugs of instant cocoa. No wine, no crystal, no catered trays. Just cocoa, dusted with a trace of rust from the kettle. "I've been chased by board members, lawyers, journalists," Charlotte said with a laugh that was half bitter, half free. "But never by my own father in the rain." Daniel smiled faintly. "You handled him better than most of my landlords," Charlotte snorted, then sobered. "Do you regret it? Being here, with me?" Daniel's gaze was steady, no hesitation. Not for a second later. When the cocoa was gone, and the garage had quieted to the hum of a single fluorescent light, Charlotte wheeled closer. Her voice softened, raw from the day. "Kiss me again." Daniel leaned in. This time, it wasn't desperate or panicked. It was slow, deliberate, a promise written in the press of lips under the hum of a flickering bulb. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and relentless, blanketing the city in silence. And in that silence, for the first time since her accident, Charlotte believed she had chosen her own path, not the one mapped by legacy, not the one paved by pity, but the one lit by the steady, stubborn presence of a man who had nothing to give but everything she needed. 3 months passed like water slipping through fingers. Toronto thawed into spring, cherry blossoms softening the hard edges of Queens Park. Charlotte Fraser had walked away from an empire and discovered that survival wasn't the same as living. The wedding was nothing like the society pages had once predicted for her. No marble halls, no celebrity guest list, no coverage in glossy magazines. Instead, it was Daniel McCarthy's garage in Hamilton, scrubbed clean for the day, transformed by neighbors and friends into something radiant. Potted plants lined the steps, borrowed chairs circled the makeshift altar, and string lights sagged gently overhead. A jazz playlist hummed from a second-hand speaker. Tinny but sweet, Charlotte sat at the center of it all in a simple ivory gown. Not the custom couture her father's advisors would have demanded, but something soft, something hers. She smiled until her cheeks ached, watching children weave between chairs, grease-stained overalls traded for button shirts, and a mechanic's calloused hands trembling slightly as they adjusted a crooked tie. Daniel looked, to her, more handsome than any man she'd ever met because he was real. The ceremony had barely begun when the air shifted. Conversations hushed. Heads turned. At the edge of the crowd, a tall figure lingered. Not in a suit, not in armor of wealth, but in a plain gray sweater and slacks. His hair was more silver than before, his posture hesitant. Richard Fraser, Titan of Bay Street, stood awkwardly among folding chairs and borrowed flowers. Charlotte's breath caught. Daniel froze, jaw tightening, ready for a battle. But Richard's eyes, blue steel, softened by something Charlotte had almost forgotten, met his. Slowly, painfully, he stepped forward. The silence was a wait until Richard extended his hand. His voice, stripped of command, was barely audible. "Love her. That's all I ask." Daniel stared, stunned. Then, slowly, he took the hand. A firm shake, not of rivals, but of men who both understood they could not control the woman at the heart of this moment. Charlotte blinked fast, fighting tears. For the first time in her life, her father had not spoken as CEO or patriarch. He had spoken as a father. The reception blurred into laughter, music, and small joys. A neighbor's toddler smeared icing across Daniel's shirt. Someone passed a guitar, and a guest sang in French accented English. For Charlotte, each moment was a jewel, brighter than any gala she had ever endured. But the true ending was not in the garage. After the last chair was folded, after the last guest had hugged them goodbye, Daniel loaded a single bag into his truck and drove them east. The road wound through Nova Scotia, where cliffs met ocean in long sighs of surf. At dawn, they reached a small, quiet beach. It wasn't famous. There were no photographers. Just the Atlantic, vast and endless, whispering against the sand. Daniel opened the passenger door, then crouched in front of her chair. His hands, rough but steady, found her waist. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice low. Charlotte nodded. "More sure than I've ever been." With careful strength, he helped her stand. Her legs trembled, every muscle quivering like it might give way. But Daniel's arms held steady, his grip firm at her hips. Charlotte took a step. The sand was cool, grainy, clinging between her toes. The ocean stretched before her, infinite and merciful. She leaned into Daniel, their breaths sensing, their laughter breaking through tears. Another step. Another. Each one not perfect, not effortless, but hers. They stood there together. No audience, no spotlight, no legacy watching. Just the beach, the breeze, and the beginning of something new. Charlotte's chest swelled, her voice barely above the waves. "This isn't the end." Daniel kissed her temple, rain and salt water mixing on their skin. "No," he whispered. "It's the beginning." And under the wide, open Canadian sky, Charlotte Fraser finally found what she had been chasing all her life. Not wealth, not legacy. Peace. And the courage to believe in love without conditions.